The black nanny slept on the floor with the twins. The African billionaire saw. And then this happened. It was a quiet evening at the luxurious estate of Nigerian billionaire Kofi Adamu. As the moonlight reflected off the sprawling marble floors, Kofi noticed something that would forever change his perspective on life. His twins, barely a year old, had been sleeping soundly in their room when their nanny, Amina, chose to lay on the cold floor beside their cribs, rather than in her own comfortable bed. Kofi, who had every luxury money could buy, was taken aback by the simple act of sacrifice and devotion that Amina displayed. He couldn't understand why she, someone who had nothing to prove, would choose to sleep on the floor for the sake of his children. But what happened next, something Kofi never saw coming, would forever alter the course of his life. Before we dive into this incredible journey of selflessness and unexpected revelations, be sure to hit that subscribe button, like this video, and turn on the notifications. Your support helps us bring you more stories of transformation and inspiring moments from the lives of extraordinary people like Kofi. Let's get started. Kofi Adamu leaned back in his leather chair, his mind swirling with the weight of his day. As one of the richest men in Africa, his life was a whirlwind of business meetings, press conferences, and endless decisions that seemed to have no end. His luxury estate, nestled in the heart of Lagos, Nigeria, was a place of peace. Well, it used to be, but even in his fortress of wealth, there are things that couldn't be bought. Trust, loyalty, and the kind of bond that transcended material wealth. It was just past midnight when he walked through the sprawling hallways of his home, his footsteps echoing off the gleaming marble floors. The air was thick with the scent of fresh jasmine, and outside, the city hummed with the pulse of life. But inside his home, there was an unusual stillness. A stillness that Kofi had learned to appreciate over the years, a calm before the storm of the following day's challenges. He hadn't anticipated what he was about to witness. His eyes, trained to observe every detail in his empire, fell upon something in the twins' nursery, a scene that, in all his years of wealth and power, had never crossed his mind. Amina, the children's nanny, was sleeping on the cold, polished floor beside the cribs of his 2-year-old twins, Maya and Micah. The sight was not one that could easily be explained. Why was she not in her own room, in her own comfortable bed, like everyone else who worked in the mansion? Kofi paused at the doorway, his heart inexplicably heavy as he observed the scene. Amina's face was soft with sleep, her body curled protectively near the cribs. One hand was gently resting on the edge of Micah's crib, while the other was tucked under her cheek like a pillow. Her breathing was slow and steady, a contrast to the fast-paced world Kofi lived in. He felt a pang of confusion. A woman who was employed in one of the most lavish households in the country, living in a home that could house armies, sleeping on the floor by the children. What was it that drove her to forgo her comfort, to surrender her own rest for the sake of these little lives? Kofi had hired Amina a year ago after an exhaustive search for a trustworthy nanny. Maya and Micah's mother, Zara, had passed away shortly after their birth due to complications, and Kofi had been left to raise them alone. His wealth and status meant nothing in the face of his grief. All he had was his children, and he was determined to give them the love and care that they deserved, even if it meant sacrificing his own life for them. Amina had been recommended by a close friend, a fellow entrepreneur who trusted her with his own children. From the moment she arrived, she had a calming presence about her, an undeniable connection with Maya and Micah. There was something about her that seemed to put the twins at ease, something that Kofi couldn't put his finger on. She was soft-spoken, diligent, and kind, but most importantly, she was devoted. However, he had never witnessed anything like this. Kofi stepped quietly into the room, his eyes flickering from Amina to his children. He watched them sleep peacefully, unaware of the world around them. They were his world. Every decision he made, every deal he closed, was for them. But as he looked at Amina, something deep inside him began to stir. This act of care, this selfless devotion, he could never remember anyone in his life doing something like this for him. He sat at the edge of the room, not wanting to disturb her, but unable to stop himself from staring. He had everything that anyone could desire: fortune, fame, power. And yet, here was a woman who had nothing to prove and yet chose to give up everything for his children. A quiet realization began to take hold of him. The money and success he had worked so tirelessly for didn't matter as much as the things he couldn't buy. Trust, loyalty, selflessness. These were the things that truly made a person valuable. As the hours passed, Kofi sat in the darkness, watching over them. He felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, but also something else, something he couldn't quite name. It was as if this act of quiet love had unlocked something deep within him, a part of himself that had been buried beneath years of business dealings and board meetings. He felt a tear slip down his cheek, though he hadn't even realized he had been holding it in. It was a moment of vulnerability that Kofi rarely allowed himself. But just as quickly as the moment arrived, it vanished. The sound of footsteps echoed from down the hall, followed by the door opening. His eldest son, Zane, entered the room, his face twisted in a mix of sleepiness and concern. "Dad, what's wrong?" Zane asked, rubbing his eyes as he stood beside Kofi. His 10-year-old frame looked too small in comparison to the towering man that Kofi had become, but in that moment, he felt like a mirror of his father. Kofi wiped his face quickly, brushing the tear away, but his voice was softer than usual. "Nothing, son. I'm just thinking." Zane sat down next to him, his gaze moving from Kofi to the sleeping figures in the room. His eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of Amina lying on the floor. "Why is she sleeping there, Dad?" Kofi sighed, his mind working through the question. "Because sometimes, Zane, people do things for reasons we may not understand. They give more than they need to, even when no one is asking them to." Zane looked at his father for a long moment, as if weighing the meaning behind his words. "So she loves us?" Kofi nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yes, son, I think she does." Just as Kofi was about to say more, the soft sound of a phone ringing broke the silence. He reached for it, glancing at the number flashing on the screen. It was a call from his lawyer, something that required his immediate attention. Kofi stood up reluctantly, casting one last look at the serene scene before him. "Zane, stay with your siblings. I'll be right back." As he walked out of the room, the door clicked shut behind him, but inside, his thoughts remained with the image of Amina sleeping on the floor. He was a man who had everything, but in that moment, he realized there was so much he still had to learn about true wealth, the kind that couldn't be measured in bank accounts. The following days were a whirlwind for Kofi Adamu. His business empire demanded his attention constantly, with meetings, calls, and decisions that stretched into every corner of his life. Yet, no matter where he was or what he was doing, his mind returned to that night. The image of Amina sleeping on the floor beside his children. The more Kofi thought about it, the more it troubled him. Here he was, a billionaire with everything that money could buy, yet he had never once considered offering such selflessness to another person. What had driven Amina to sacrifice her comfort for his children in such an intimate way? His mind couldn't let go of the question, and the nagging curiosity made him begin to question not only his relationship with Amina, but also the very way he viewed the people around him. Over the next few weeks, he watched her closely. Every time she walked into a room, Kofi couldn't help but notice the subtle care in the way she moved around the house. She had a kind of quiet grace about her that was different from the showy displays of wealth or power that Kofi had grown accustomed to in his business dealings. The way she interacted with the twins was something almost sacred. There was a tenderness in her touch that made Kofi feel something he had never felt before. One morning, Kofi woke up early and made his way to the children's nursery. Amina was already there, her soft voice singing a lullaby to Maya, who was teething and clearly in pain. Amina's voice was soothing, and Kofi found himself drawn to her, as if her presence alone could make the world stop turning. He quietly entered the room, watching her as she expertly massaged the twins' backs, easing their discomfort with a few simple movements. Kofi's heart clenched in his chest. He had everything in the world, a kingdom built from his ambition and determination, but this simple act of care was something he had never truly understood until now. She looked up and smiled at him, a warm, knowing smile that seemed to carry an unspoken understanding between them. "Good morning, sir," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Good morning, Amina," Kofi replied softly, standing in the doorway. "You always seem to be here early, taking care of everything. I wonder, why do you do it? Why do you give so much of yourself?" Amina paused for a moment, as if considering his question carefully. Her eyes shifted to the twins, then back to Kofi. "Because I care," she said simply. "These children are a blessing, sir. I have no other family, no other purpose. When I look at them, I see the future. And if I can make their lives better, even in the smallest way, then I will." Her words hit Kofi like a thunderclap. He had been raised to believe that success was measured in wealth and influence, in material achievements. But here was Amina, a woman with so little in terms of material wealth. Yet she carried within her an abundance of something much more precious: love, compassion, and an unshakable sense of duty. Kofi sat down next to her, his mind swirling. "I've built an empire, Amina, but I've never thought about giving myself like that. I've always thought about what I can gain, what I can achieve." "You've given a lot, sir," Amina interrupted gently. "But sometimes the most important thing we can give is our time and our heart. You have done great things, but perhaps the greatest thing you can do is care for those around you in ways that can't be measured in money." Kofi's gaze softened, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to be vulnerable. "I've spent so much time building my empire that I forgot what truly matters," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been so focused on the world outside that I haven't even stopped to truly see the world within." Amina nodded, her smile never faltering. "It's never too late to change, sir." That night, as Kofi lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about their conversation. He thought about his late wife, Zara, and how she had always encouraged him to be more than just a businessman. Zara had always told him that true wealth came from the love and bonds we form with others, not just the material things we could accumulate. But he had dismissed her words, thinking that his work would somehow make up for the lack of connection in his life. But now, staring at the ceiling in his grand bed, Kofi realized how wrong he had been. Amina, a woman with so little material wealth, had more of what mattered than he ever could have imagined. She had given him a glimpse into a world that he had closed off for too long, and now he felt as though he were standing on the edge of something far greater than his business empire. The next morning, Kofi took action. He called a meeting with his lawyer and his closest advisors, requesting that they begin drawing up plans for something entirely new, a foundation dedicated to supporting those who needed help the most. He didn't know exactly what it would look like yet, but he knew it had to be something that went beyond just donating money. It had to be about creating opportunities for real connection, real change. As the days passed, Kofi found himself growing closer to Amina, not just as a boss, but as a man seeking to understand the deeper values of life. He began to recognize the ways in which she had impacted his world, how she had unknowingly opened his eyes to a new path, one that didn't focus solely on profit, but on the impact one could have on others. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. As Kofi made plans for foundation, he began facing resistance from his inner circle. His closest allies, those who had built his empire with him, were skeptical. They questioned why he wanted to shift focus from business to philanthropy, why he wanted to devote his time and resources to something that wasn't directly tied to profit. One afternoon, as Kofi sat at his desk overlooking the city skyline, his trusted advisor, Tund, entered the room with a concerned look. "Sir, with all due respect, are you sure this is a direction you want to take? You worked too hard to build this empire. What happens to your business if you start focusing on charity?" Kofi took a deep breath, leaning back in his chair. He thought of Amina's words, of her unwavering dedication to the children, and how much she had inspired him. "Tund, I've spent my life building an empire. But what is an empire if it's not built on something greater than just profit? I want to make a difference, not just in my business, but in the lives of others." Tund was silent for a moment, clearly taken aback by Kofi's conviction. "If you're sure, sir," he said reluctantly, "then I'll support you. But know that this will change everything." And so, with Tund's reluctant support, Kofi set forth on a new journey, one that was not just about business, but about legacy, compassion, and creating a lasting impact. Kofi's decision to step away from the corporate world for a while, to focus on philanthropy, had been met with mixed reactions. The news of his plans for a foundation spread quickly within his circle, and while some praised him for his selflessness, others questioned his judgment. The tension that had once been part of his daily life, dealing with pressure and competition, now took a different form. It wasn't the pressure to succeed financially, but the pressure to ensure that his new venture would be successful, impactful, and most of all, true to his heart. He was facing a challenge he had never anticipated. Resistance not from the outside world, but from his own inner circle. His trusted business partners, those who had helped him rise to the top, were now questioning his priorities. They didn't understand why he would risk everything for something that seemed, to them, like a distraction. "Sir," Tun said during a tense meeting at Kofi's office, "you've built something incredible. You're one of the wealthiest men in the world. Are you sure you want to divert your attention from expanding your business empire to this charity work? We don't have time to waste on something that doesn't promise any financial return." Kofi had grown used to Tun's skepticism, but this time, it stung. Tun had been with him since the beginning, had been a trusted advisor and friend, and now, to hear him voice doubts about Kofi's newfound vision was a blow to his confidence. "I understand your concerns," Kofi said, trying to keep his voice steady. "But this is not just about money. It's about making a real difference. My success has given me the power to change lives, and I don't want to waste it." Tun's brow furrowed. "You've always been focused on the bottom line, Kofi. What makes you think you can succeed in something so uncertain?" Kofi leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in thought. The weight of Tun's words lingered, but his resolve was stronger. "I don't expect you to understand, Tun, but I've learned something recently, something that Amina has taught me. Money isn't the measure of a man's success. The way you touch people's lives, the legacy you leave behind, that's what matters." Tun was silent, and Kofi could feel the tension in the room as it thickened. Finally, Tun stood, his face set in a grim expression. "I can't support this decision, Kofi. You're risking everything we've worked for. If you choose this path, you do it without my help." Kofi didn't flinch. He knew this would be difficult, but he was ready. "Then I will go it alone, Tun, but I'm not changing my mind." As Tun left the room, the silence that followed felt heavy, suffocating. Kofi stared at the papers on his desk, feeling the pressure of his decision weighing on him. He had spent years building an empire, and now he was willing to put it all on the line for something that felt far more significant than any business deal he had ever made. The next few days were filled with similar conversations, each one pulling him further away from the world he had known. His partners, his friends, and even a few family members couldn't understand why he was so committed to this new cause. They saw it as a fleeting interest, something that would eventually pass. But Kofi's heart was no longer in the world of endless profits and high-stakes deals. It was in the world of change, of making a difference that would last long after his name had faded from the world of business. One evening, after another long day of business meetings and tense discussions, Kofi sat in his study, contemplating his next steps. The foundation was still in its infancy, and there was so much work to be done. He needed to raise awareness, gather support, and create a sustainable model that could continue to help people for years to come. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed to inspire others to join him on this journey. That's when the idea hit him, an event, a gala, a gathering of influential people who could see the vision he had for the future, an opportunity to unite the business world with philanthropy, to show that success wasn't just about the bottom line. He would invite his closest friends, business partners, and fellow entrepreneurs, and he would make them see what he had learned from Amina and the sacrifices she had made. It wasn't going to be easy, but Kofi had never shied away from challenges. He knew that, in order to succeed, he needed to convince the world that his vision was worth supporting. As the event day approached, Kofi felt a surge of nervous energy. He was excited but anxious. Would his message resonate with the people he admired most? Would they see the value in giving, in making a difference? The night of the gala arrived, and Kofi stood at the front of the ballroom, surrounded by some of the wealthiest and most influential people in the country. The room was filled with laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses, but Kofi's eyes were focused on the stage. His speech was prepared, and the moment he had been waiting for was almost here. The lights dimmed, and the crowd fell silent as Kofi took the stage. He looked out over the sea of faces, each one representing the pinnacle of success in business. He cleared his throat, his heart pounding in his chest. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kofi began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "thank you for being here tonight. As many of you know, I've spent my life building an empire, but I've come to realize that there is something far more valuable than wealth. It is the ability to change lives, to make a difference that extends beyond our businesses and our profits." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "There is a woman in my life who has taught me this lesson. Amina, my children's nanny. She's shown me that true wealth lies not in what we have, but in what we give. And so, tonight, I ask you all to join me in making a difference, not just for ourselves, but for those who need us the most." The room was silent, and for a moment, Kofi feared that his message had fallen flat. But then, a hand raised from the crowd. It was one of the most influential businessmen in the room, a man who had long been known for his philanthropic efforts. "I'm with you, Kofi," the man said, standing up. "If you're willing to give, then so am I." One by the days following the gala were a blur. Kofi could hardly believe the success of the event. His foundation had received an outpouring of support, not just in financial terms, but from people who genuinely believed in the cause he was championing. Business moguls, philanthropists, and even those with no prior ties to Kofi's world rallied behind him, pledging their commitment to making a difference. The momentum was undeniable. But as the days turned into weeks, the shine of victory began to dull. Kofi's decision to shift focus away from his empire and towards social good continued to create tension with those closest to him. His most trusted advisor, Tun, had not spoken to him since their heated conversation. Other members of his team were quietly questioning his judgment. They didn't understand why Kofi was willing to risk everything for a venture that didn't guarantee any financial return. The pressure mounted. Kofi's phone rang constantly. Calls from his board members, investors, and even family. Each one seemed to echo the same sentiment. "Are you sure about this, Kofi? We've built something great. You can't just walk away from it now." But it wasn't just business matters that troubled Kofi. The internal struggle within him was just as fierce. Despite the growing support for his foundation, a nagging voice in his mind kept whispering that he was making a mistake. It was the same voice that had driven him to build his empire in the first place. The voice that told him to push forward, no matter the cost. And now, that same voice was telling him to turn back before he lost everything. One afternoon, after a particularly long day of meetings, Kofi walked into his study, exhausted and mentally drained. He hadn't slept properly in days, and his body was starting to feel the effects of it. He collapsed into his chair, rubbing his temples as he tried to clear his mind. His phone buzzed on the desk, and he glanced at it absent-mindedly. It was a message from Amina, a simple note that read, "I hope today was a good day for you, sir. I made your favorite stew for dinner. If you're hungry, please come to the kitchen when you're ready." The message was a small comfort, one that Kofi desperately needed. It reminded him of the simplicity of life, something that he had almost forgotten amidst the chaos of his decisions. The quiet, steady presence of Amina was something he had come to rely on more than he realized. She didn't ask for anything in return. She just gave without question. And in her, Kofi had found something that money could never buy, a sense of peace. He stood up and made his way to the kitchen, hoping that the familiar smell of stew would help clear his mind. As he entered, Amina was there, stirring a pot on the stove, her back to him. "Good evening, sir," she said without turning around. "I hope you had a good day." Kofi nodded, taking a seat at the kitchen table. "It's been challenging," he admitted, his voice heavier than usual. "I'm not sure if I'm doing the right thing. Amina, I've spent my whole life building an empire, and now I'm trying to throw it all away for something that might not work." Amina paused for a moment, then turned to face him. Her gaze was calm, but there was a depth to it that Kofi couldn't ignore. She set the spoon down on the counter and walked over to him, sitting across from him at the table. "You're not throwing it all away, sir," she said softly. "You're changing the world. But sometimes, change feels like loss before it becomes something better. I've seen people struggle with the unknown, but those who push through, who embrace change, are the ones who make the most impact." Kofi stared at her, his mind racing. But what if I'm wrong? What if all this foundation, this charity work, just ends up costing me everything? Amina's eyes softened, and she leaned forward slightly. You don't know what will happen, sir. No one ever does. But what I do know is that your heart is in the right place, and that is more important than anything else. Kofi was silent, his gaze fixed on Amina. In that moment, he realized that she had become more than just a nanny to him. She had become a guiding light, a voice of reason when the weight of his own doubts threatened to crush him. She had a wisdom that Kofi respected, even if he hadn't fully understood it until now. Thank you, Amina, Kofi said quietly. I needed to hear that. She smiled, standing up to serve the stew. As she placed the bowl in front of him, she said, You're welcome, sir. But remember, no one ever changes the world by staying comfortable. You have to take risks. The greatest people in history didn't play it safe. They embraced the unknown and forged a path where there was none. Kofi took a deep breath, feeling a renewed sense of determination. It wasn't going to be easy, and he knew that. But Amina was right. If he wanted to make a real difference, he had to step outside of his comfort zone. The world wasn't waiting for him to figure it out. He had to act. The following week, Kofi found himself facing another hurdle. The board of directors of his empire had called an emergency meeting, and they were less than pleased with his recent decisions. They demanded to know how much longer he intended to divert his focus from the company. They were concerned that his newfound passion for philanthropy was a distraction that could harm the business. Kofi sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable as the board members aired their grievances. The tension in the room was palpable. He had always prided himself on his ability to negotiate and steer difficult conversations. But this was different. This was his life, his legacy, and he wasn't willing to give it up. I understand your concerns, Kofi began, his voice steady. But this foundation is something I believe in, something I know is going to change lives. I don't intend to abandon my business, but I can't continue to ignore the things that truly matter. One of the board members, a longtime associate named Collins, spoke up. You've made your fortune through hard work, Kofi, but you're playing with fire here. Philanthropy doesn't make money. It costs money. And if you keep pushing this foundation, we could lose everything. Kofi met Collins's gaze, his eyes unwavering. You think I don't know that? He said quietly. I've been where you are, Collins. I know the value of hard work and profit, but I also know that there is more to life than money. I'm not asking for your support in this, but I'm asking for your understanding. The room fell silent. Kofi had never been so firm in his convictions. His journey was far from over, and he knew that he had made the right choice. No matter how difficult it was, he had to push forward. He had to follow the path that Amina had helped him see, a path of change, of growth. The weeks that followed were filled with endless phone calls, strategy meetings, and negotiations. Kofi had made his choice, and there was no turning back. He had thrown himself into his new mission with the same intensity that had driven his success in business. But every decision he made for the foundation seemed to ripple out, affecting everything from his company's stock prices to his relationships with old friends and colleagues. Despite the overwhelming support from his newfound allies, the tension within his business empire continued to grow. The shareholders were becoming increasingly uneasy, and whispers of Kofi's distracted leadership began to spread. The media, once enamored with his entrepreneurial success, started to question whether he was losing focus. One morning, as Kofi sat in his office, staring out at the city skyline, his phone rang. It was Tund. Kofi hadn't heard from him in days, and he wasn't sure he was ready to speak to him, but he answered anyway. Tund, Kofi greeted, his voice guarded. Kofi, Tund replied, his tone serious. I need to talk to you. This can't keep going on. The foundation, your focus on it, it's affecting everything. Your business is in trouble. I'm telling you, this is not sustainable. Kofi closed his eyes, letting out a slow breath. I know, Tund, but I can't ignore this. The foundation is about something bigger than all of this. It's about legacy, making a real difference. And if I'm not willing to risk it all for that, then what was the point of all this success? I understand what you're trying to do. Tun said, his voice softening. But I've seen you lose focus before. We can't afford to let that happen again. If you lose the company, the foundation won't matter. You'll have nothing left to give. Kofi's jaw tightened. I've thought about that, Tun, every day. But the question is, when is enough enough? When do I stop chasing profits and start focusing on something that truly matters? I'm not ready to let go of the vision I have. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Kofi could hear Tun's heavy sigh before he spoke again. I want to support you, Kofi. You know that, but this isn't the way. You need to figure out how to balance both. Kofi's heart felt heavy as he hung up the phone. The weight of his decision was suffocating. He had promised himself that he would do this, that he would change lives, but he hadn't anticipated how much he would have to sacrifice to make it happen. Every move he made seemed to bring him further from the world he had built, and with every step forward, it felt like he was losing pieces of himself. The pressure only intensified when he received a call from one of his oldest friends, Amara. She had always been a pillar of support for him, and she knew Kofi better than anyone. Her voice, usually warm and reassuring, now carried a note of concern. Kofi, I've been hearing things, Amara said, her voice cautious. People are starting to talk. The business world is noticing. Are you sure about this? Kofi swallowed hard. Amara, I can't keep pretending that this is enough. I've spent my whole life building this empire, but it feels hollow. I don't want to wake up one day and realize that I missed out on something bigger. I understand, Amara said, her tone softening. But you've got to be careful. People admire you, Kofi. They look up to you. Don't let that admiration turn to disappointment, because you made the wrong choice. Kofi knew she was right. Every decision he had made in his life had been strategic. He was known for his foresight, his ability to build something from nothing. But now, as he ventured into uncharted territory, he felt like he was no longer in control of his own fate. The foundation was growing, but so were the doubts that clung to him. That night, after the phone call ended, Kofi found himself standing in the hallway of his home, his gaze drawn to the children's nursery. He could hear the faint sound of Maya and Micah's giggles, their voices soft and sweet. Amina was playing with them on the floor, her laughter echoing through the house. Kofi stepped inside, watching her interact with the twins. A smile tugged at his lips as he observed the simple beauty of the moment. Amina's hands moved effortlessly as she cradled the children, her presence a steady calm in the chaos of his life. She had no agenda, no ulterior motive. She simply cared. He approached her, his footsteps soft on the carpet. Amina, he said, his voice quiet. She looked up, offering him a warm smile. Good evening, sir, she said, her voice gentle. Kofi took a deep breath. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. Amina, every choice I make feels like it's pulling me in a different direction. The foundation, my business. I don't know if I can keep both going. Amina set Maya and Micah down in their cribs and stood up to face him. You've been trying to do everything, sir, she said softly, but you can't do it all at once. It's okay to feel conflicted. The important thing is to follow your heart. You've built something great, but what will be greater is what you leave behind. If you truly want to make a difference, you can't let fear stop you. Kofi looked at her, the weight of her words settling into his chest. She had a way of cutting through the noise, of seeing what mattered when everything else seemed to fade into the background. I'm afraid, Amina, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm afraid that I'll lose everything I've worked for, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to handle that. Amina's eyes softened, and she placed a hand gently on his shoulder. You don't have to do it alone. You've already built something remarkable. But now, you have the chance to build something even greater. It's not about the money, sir. It's about the change you can create in the world. Her words echoed in his mind as he left the nursery. His heart. The next few months were the most difficult of Kofi's life. Every day seemed to bring new challenges. He felt the weight of his decisions more acutely than ever, and at times, it felt as though the world around him was crumbling. His business empire, once the center of his existence, now seemed to be slipping through his fingers. But his commitment to the foundation never wavered. He had made his choice, and he was determined to see it through. Kofi spent sleepless nights working on the foundation. securing funding, meeting with potential partners, and navigating the bureaucratic hurdles that stood in his way. But every time he doubted himself, he thought of the children, Maya, Micah, and of Amina. Her quiet strength had become his anchor, reminding him why he had made this decision in the first place. One morning, as he sat in his office, reviewing the progress reports for both his business and the foundation, a phone call interrupted his thoughts. It was from Tund. "Sir, we got a major problem." Tund's voice crackled through the line, his tone urgent. "What is it?" Kofi asked, already feeling the familiar tension rising in his chest. "The company's stock prices are plummeting. There's speculation that you've been neglecting your duties. Your absence is being noticed, and if we don't act quickly, we could lose everything." Kofi's stomach dropped. The very thing he had feared was coming true. His decision to split his attention between his business and the foundation was taking its toll. His hands gripped the desk, knuckles turning white as the reality of the situation set in. He had put everything on the line for something greater, but now it seemed like the cost was too high. For a moment, he considered his options. He could return to his empire, pour all his energy back into the company, and regain control. He had the power to fix this. But as he sat there, staring at the reports, he realized that doing so would betray the very purpose of the foundation. He couldn't go back now. "I need time," Kofi said, his voice firm. "I'll make a decision soon, but not right now. I have to see this through." Tund was silent for a moment before responding. "Understood, sir. We'll hold things together as best we can. Just don't take too long." Kofi hung up, staring at the phone in his hand. His heart was heavy with the weight of his decision. But as the minutes passed, something inside him clicked. The true measure of a man's worth wasn't in how much he accumulated, but in what he gave. He had given everything to his business, but he hadn't given enough to the world. Now it was time to change that. Determined, Kofi called a meeting with his closest advisors and allies. This time, however, it wasn't about saving the company. It was about finding a way to balance both the foundation and his business. He needed to show his team that his vision was still intact, and that he could build both the future of his empire and the future of the people he cared about. In the meeting, Kofi stood before them, his resolve stronger than ever. "I've made mistakes. I've let my focus drift, but I'm not giving up on either of these causes. We have a responsibility, not just to our shareholders, but to the world. This foundation represents the future, and our business, if we do it right, can support that future." His team listened, their skepticism beginning to fade. Kofi was offering them a new path, a path that would require everyone to step outside of their comfort zones and embrace change. It was the same thing that he had been telling himself all along. He wasn't asking them to follow him blindly. He was asking them to believe in a new vision, one that would align both profit and purpose. Over the next few weeks, Kofi worked tirelessly to ensure that both the foundation and the business could thrive together. He made key investments, restructured parts of the company, and brought in fresh talent to help move the company forward. But more importantly, he remained true to his mission. The foundation was not just a charity. It was a catalyst for change, and Kofi was determined to make a success. By the time the next quarterly report came in, Kofi's hard work was beginning to pay off. The company's stock prices slowly began to stabilize, and the foundation's impact was becoming more and more evident. The media, which had once doubted Kofi's decision to split his focus, began to praise him for his vision and perseverance. Kofi had managed to strike a balance between his business empire and his philanthropic mission, proving that it was possible to build wealth while making a meaningful difference in the world. One evening, as he sat in his office, reviewing the latest developments, Kofi received a message from Amina. It was simple, but it carried a weight that words could not fully express. "The children are doing well, sir. They are happy." Amina's words struck Kofi deeply. In all the chaos of his business decisions, his fears about the future, and his battles to keep everything afloat, he had forgotten what it was all for. It wasn't just the foundation. It wasn't just the company. It was Maya, Micah, and the future he wanted to give them. That night, after another long day, Kofi walked into the nursery to find Amina play with the twins. The sight of the three of them together, laughing and carefree, filled him with a deep sense of peace. "Amina," Kofi said softly, his voice full of emotion. "Thank you. You were right. I couldn't have done this without you." Amina looked up, her eyes warm. "I'm just doing my part, sir. But it's you who made the choice to change. And that, sir, is the greatest thing anyone can do." Kofi sat down beside her, watching Maya and Micah as they played. In that moment, he realized that his journey was only just beginning. The foundation had succeeded, his business was thriving again, and he had found a new balance between the two. But more importantly, he had found something even greater: purpose. As the twins laughed, their innocence a reminder of everything Kofi had fought for, he knew that he had made the right choice. It wasn't about the wealth he had built. It was about the legacy he would leave behind, one of compassion, change, and a willingness to sacrifice for the greater good. Kofi smiled, his heart full. It had been a long, difficult journey, but the reward was worth it. He had created a life worth living, a life that would inspire future generations to come. And as he watched Amina with the children, Kofi understood that true success wasn't measured by how much you had, but by what you gave.